Hello, book lovers. I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio and the Penn Faulkner Foundation. I write novels, and on this show, I get to do one of my favorite things in the world, talk to other writers about their brand new books. On this show, you'll hear from authors who aren't famous yet, but probably will be. And remember, you heard them here first. Last season, I spoke with Emma Patty about her novel, Tilt. That book since became a bestseller and is a finalist for the Barnes & Noble Discover Prize. You can catch that conversation on the NHPR website or wherever you get your podcasts. Today, I am super excited to introduce you to debut novelist Ruben Reyes Jr. and his brand new novel, Archive of Unknown Universes. Ruben, welcome to Check This Out.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here today. So Archive of Unknown Universes has a machine at the very center of the book. It's called the Diffractor, and it sets up two alternative timelines for your characters. Can you tell us sort of very briefly what the machine is? Because we're going to really dig into that later. But tell us sort of what the book is about in these two timelines.
Yeah, so the device at the heart of this book allows users to see basically the what-ifs of their lives. In the novel, I describe them as short films of what could have been. But they're very limited, and so the characters in this novel turn to these machines for guidance, but they're asking big questions that the machine itself cannot totally answer. But overall, it follows two families over alternate timelines of the Salvadoran Civil War, hinging on the life and death of a guerrilla soldier who is main character in this book and has a sweeping love story.
And so in one timeline, he lives, and the other timeline, he doesn't.
Exactly. And that's kind of what splits the two 2018s apart.
And so really what you're getting to when we're looking at these two timelines is this idea that all of life is really one decision and then another.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking a lot about, well, to go backwards a little bit, I went on a research trip in 2018 where I got to meet some guerrilla soldiers. Both of my parents are from El Salvador, but growing up, I didn't know too much about the war. But with this funding from Harvard, where two of my protagonists attend, I was able to meet some guerrilla soldiers, hear about their experience, and really think about what it would have been like to live through such a difficult, traumatic moment of political change. And the novel kind of takes up those questions about the intergenerational impact of war.
Wait a minute, you just said that very casually, like, oh, I met these two guerrilla soldiers. Wait, record scratch? Hold on, let's talk about that. Guerrilla soldiers, tell me about that.
Well, it was actually the kind of thing where I grew up not knowing much. I knew a civil war had happened, but I didn't know how it intersected with my life. And when I started studying academically, all these kind of connections started popping up. Among them, that my mother had really just lived through the war in rural El Salvador, where she grew up. But another connection was that my godfather, his brother, had actually been very involved, kind of at a high level. And so he connected me with this guy who at this point, was just living his life. It was 30 some years after the war had officially ended. He worked in security and was just like willing to talk to me about some of their experiences and connected me with some of his friends. But yeah, it was like this personal connection that got me through the door to do these oral histories that I didn't even know I had until I started asking questions.
So what's it like to interview a former guerrilla soldier? Is that like hush hush, or is it, out in the open just talking about it?
I think what struck me, and this was probably like a year or more than a year before I started writing this novel in earnest, but what struck me was how normal he was, right? Like, I think when you think about a revolutionary guerrilla soldier, at least I had this image of this kind of macho dude with a very long beard, all about the revolution. And when I met him, he definitely still had some politics. He talked about what they were trying to accomplish during the war, but he was just, someone trying to build a life. When the war ended and the peace accords were signed, there was a desire in El Salvador to kind of move on from it, right? To bring everyone into society, regardless of what side of the war they were on, and to move forward. And this person who I was talking to had done that. He'd been exiled for a while, then came back to El Salvador and started rebuilding a life. And I think that's why the characters in this novel, especially the guerrilla soldiers, struggle with that. And part of the plot is seeing how these guerrilla soldiers will build lives for themselves after the war has ended.
So we know the surface plot, but what is this book really about?
When I was writing this novel, I really wanted to toggle between the kind of big political questions and those kind of small, intimate human questions. And I think the novel is both personal and political in really interesting ways. It's one of the things that I'm proudest of. The fact that these characters are living through big political moments, but that I've been able to focus on their lives and their relationships to each other throughout it.
All right, Ruben, will you introduce us to your book? Can you read for us from your new novel, Archive of Unknown Universes?
Yes, totally. As I hinted earlier, this novel is about a lot of things, but it's also about love. And so I want to read a passage that I think captures both the love story and the politics of the book a little bit. 1979. They track their love in deaths. When Neto visits Managua for the first time, the government murders 11 students at a protest in broad daylight. Rafael lands in Ilopango in 1977, and just 25 miles away, a nightmare descends on Aguilares. A church is shot up, and 3 Jesuit priests are kidnapped, then disappeared. Every couple of months, with every letter Neto and Rafael send, a new death squad pops up. Finally, when they're in Havana in 1978, no one they know dies. They take it as a blessing, a good omen at last. Death, Rafael prays, will not trail them this time. He waits outside the airport until a red truck appears, the passenger door forced open. He half expects a rifle pointed right at his chest. But no, it's far less deadly than facing a gunman, but just as thrilling. There he is, full of life, aglow with a grin Rafael knows well. Neto.
Beautiful. Ruben, thank you for reading for us from your new novel, Archive of Unknown Universes. You are taking us right to the heart of the love story that is really at the center of this book. It's between your characters, Neto and Rafael. Tell us about those two characters and their love for each other.
Yeah, so Neto and Rafael are 2 guerrilla soldiers in late 70s in El Salvador, but also Managua, Nicaragua, and also Havana, Cuba. And they meet under the guise of the revolutionary effort, or the leftist effort across the region. But they quickly fall in love. But there are some things that keep them apart, both the politics and both the personal kind of hang-ups that some of them have, especially Neto. And the novel kind of tracks their love story over the decades in some ways.
It's such a touching love story, but also it's hidden. It's forbidden love. They're not openly gay, and they have to hide their love for one another.
Yeah, I was really interested in this idea that the revolutionary movements in El Salvador, but also I think in other parts of the world, were these really hyper masculine, kind of machista movements. Women were involved at times, but the movements themselves were very, very masculine, hyper masculine almost. And I asked myself what it would be like for a gay man who believed in the revolution to be involved in it. And yeah, so that was kind of the impetus for thinking about that as something that would add tension to their love story.
There were secrets wrapped in secrets because they're operating in secret. They don't want anyone to know, not even all of their family members to know exactly what they're doing. And they also don't want anyone to know about their love for one another.
Yeah. I mean, this idea of secrets and of silences is a big theme in the novel, just because I feel like it feels very real to me. I think when we go through, especially when we go through hardship or something that's traumatic, once we live through it, it's kind of hard to look back and talk about it. And one of the questions I was asking myself is like, what are long-term effects of trauma? And there's actually a little bit of sociological research regarding Salvadorans specifically that says that silence is one of the things that Salvadoran immigrants had to do to protect themselves after the war.
So they're both forgers. They're both master forgers. And so what they're doing is creating all sorts of documents. And I love this idea that they were faking things because in a sense they were faking their own lives too, right, to everyone around them. How did you learn about forgery enough to write that into the novel?
Oh, a lot of imagination, but the origin of it actually came from that research trip I mentioned. It was one of those things that I think someone mentioned offhand, the fact that they had done similar to work that the guerrilla soldiers in this novel do. And I think I also got the opportunity to see someone's fake ID that I think they still had somewhere in their office from those years. And so, when I saw the idea, I wondered like, well, who made that? Someone had to make that. And that's kind of the task that I give Neto, especially. But yeah, I mean, I think on one level, right, as a fiction writer, it just adds a little bit of tension and intrigue to the novel, which anyone needs to keep a reader going. So I think on the very base level, it was just like this really interesting thing that hopefully a reader wants to learn more about.
Yeah, and also to be a forger, you have to be so exact. And we even see a great scene where Neto realizes his line is off just by a fraction of an inch, but it's enough that he thinks it will be caught. And so he spent hours on this document and he has to go back and start all over again. But in order to properly make the document, he has to be calm and together and focused. And I just kept thinking how hard that must be in the middle of a war to know people's lives depend on this document and you have to be calm while you're doing it.
I mean, the stakes. There are many reasons why I wanted to set this in the Salvadoran Civil War, right? It's a moment in history that I think has been misunderstood, if it's understood at all or talked about at all. And so that was part of the rationale. But I also think it's such a tense and complicated moment that, dropping these characters in that moment really allowed me to play around with stakes and add some stakes to the novel, especially because, there's stakes in Ana and Luis's, 2018 timelines too. But their setting's a little bit more normal, right? They're mostly on a college campus or doing academic research, which is not super high stakes for a novel.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Ruben Reyes Jr., and we are talking about his brand new debut novel, Archive of Unknown Universes. We've been talking about the main love story in the book, which is really between Neto and Rafael. And we are now going to dig into, you've mentioned them a few times, Ana and Luis, or Ana and Domingo. And they're another love story. And they were so cold compared to Neto and Rafael. Neto and Rafael were so passionate and so in love. And every time I saw Ana in love, I sort of cringed, like it wasn't really love, but it was love. Let's talk about that relationship.
Yeah, so Ana and Luis, or Ana and Domingo, as people will discover, students at Harvard in 2018. And you're totally right. Their love is a little bit different. The ironic thing is that they're more or less the same age as Neto and Rafael were, but their love is different because it feels a little bit more based on circumstance. And the reason I was thinking a lot about that was both because of my personal experiences with relationships at that time, but also because it was a really interesting question, right? This question, is love predestined or is love something we choose to make work? And the line between those things is really tricky. I think in my brain, I'm a romantic, but I'm also a pragmatist. And so sometimes those two feelings are at odds. And by contrasting Ana and Luis and Neto and Rafael, I got to explore the many ways one can be in love.
Right, because we actually see Ana and Luis thinking, should we work on this? Versus with Neto and Rafael, they just tumble into this love. Like they can't stop touching each other, thinking about each other, writing to each other. And Ana and Luis are like, oh, we haven't kissed in a while, type thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so this brings us to the very center, to this diffractor, to this machine, because to me, this machine, it shows alternative timelines, possibilities for your life, but it's really sort of the regrets machine, the what if, because Ana seems pulled to it because she's like, am I in the right love? What if I did something else? Let's talk about the diffractor. What is it?
Yeah, so it's this device that you plug to your temple and ask a guiding question, and then it'll show you what could have been in some ways. In the world of the novel, it's only supposed to be used for academic research or research in general, and there's limits on who can have them. Universities are some of the few places where you can access these things. But of course, with any tempting technology, people use it for other reasons. They go seeking some kind of guidance. That's why the restrictions are there in the first place.
And so what it is you can peer into this machine and you can choose to either see it visually or a written version of other possibilities for your life. Then you could see like 6 or 30, like there are huge numbers of variations that you can come out with.
Yeah, definitely. And when I was thinking up this technology, I wanted there to be limits, because the kind of question, for me at least, at the heart of the diffractor is like, how much can we actually learn from this machine? And the bigger question I was thinking about is like, what are the limits of technology, which is something I explore in all my work, I think.
And, when you sit down and you put something like this in a novel, a sort of science fiction element, you have to have very clear rules, right? And you have to say, this is what it can do, this is what it can't do, this is how it works. So, how did you lay all that out and figure all that out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was a little bit of the process of editing was figuring out those rules and really constricting it. Because the problem is if a device is too powerful, right, then there's no stakes. Like a character can learn everything they need to from this device and they won't go on the journey that I send them on. But pretty early on, I had the sense of how the machine would work. I think the idea that someone had to bring a question came in later. It helped me really characterize the characters, right, and get to what they were thinking about or struggling with in a way that wasn't in the first draft. And then I also decided to have a little bit of fun with it later on. That's why some of the interlocutors or the people that guide you through the process when you use this machine are kind of ridiculous and absurd, right? We have Avril Lavigne, we have Ryan Seacrest, we have a lot of pop culture references.
It's a funny machine because you have to guide the machine and say who you want to be your guide. So you have to say, I have this question. I want to know, could I have fallen in love with somebody else? And then I want Avril Lavigne to tell me about that. And then it replies with lyrics from her songs or, in her sort of voice. So it's very funny. And it really reminded me of, I don't know, are you a Harry Potter fan at all?
Yeah, I did read all of it. Yes.
Yeah, so the Mirror of Erised, which is desire spelled backwards, Harry Potter is sitting in front of the mirror, seeing what he wanted to see, which is his parents. And anytime we have a time machine or something like your diffractor, I think it's about regrets and this what ifs. It's like, I'm not happy with where I am now, and I could be somewhere else. And there's this fear that you could become addicted to it. So that's why it's very limited, right? And that's why you're clear in the rules. You're only allowed to use it 3 times a year or whatever. Let's talk about that addictive element.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that really emerges pretty quickly in this book is that people are kind of projecting or coming to this device for things that the device might not be able to offer them or doesn't even pretend to offer them, right? And I was thinking a lot about parallels. It's different in many ways, but I was thinking about tarot or astrology or even certain religions, right? And the way that oftentimes these things that are a little bit more spiritual offer what people need when they're seeking them. They need some kind of guidance, they need some kind of support. I think the line between seeking kind of guidance every so often and fully relying on some external thing to help you figure out your internal problems or the path that you want to be on gets really tricky. And so there's this kind of fear of addiction from many people about this device. And honestly, I think if I had access to the diffractor, I think I would be on it a little bit too much, right? Like, I think I would be susceptible to it too.
Right? How could you not? Because you're thinking, what are all the different ways? I made this decision, but what if I had gone this way or that way? And you have a great line in the book. You can drive yourself crazy thinking about what might be on the other side of a door.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just how I am, right? I think at many points in my life, I've asked myself, what if I'd gone to a different college? What if I'd never moved, from California? What if I never started dating this person? What if I never stopped dating this person? And I think it's this kind of universal question that I'm sure I'll continue to ask myself. And it's such a rich one, which is why the novel really hinges on what ifs.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Ruben Reyes Jr., and we are talking about his brand new debut novel, Archive of Unknown Universes. Ruben, let's talk about the title. Why is it an archive of unknown universes?
When I was writing this, I think when you read this, you realize that I was a student of history at some point. I still am in a more casual way. But in college, I was reading a lot of stuff about archives as a historical kind of phenomenon, right? And really specifically about the question of who gets left out of the archives. There's that, at this point, cliched term that history is written by the winners, but there's a lot of truth to it. And this novel, I think, in some ways, was a way of trying to imagine or write people who might have been erased or silenced in the archives, writing them back. That's why I think there's so many intersectional, marginal kind of identities for these characters, including Neto and Raphael. And so I think that's why archives in the title. And Unknown Universes hints at the technology and the kind of multiverse thing that I have going on here.
So archives and history are certainly the center. You mentioned briefly that this book takes place or takes us to a little bit of El Salvador, Nicaragua, Cuba. Why those three places? How are the revolutions with those three countries all interconnected?
Partially it's historical, right? During the Cold War, there was this fear in the United States that Cuba was influencing the rest of Latin America, and it's what motivated the U.S. government to funnel so much money and ammunition and weapons into the whole region, especially Central America. Uh, and that's a political decision that changed the life of thousands and thousands of Central Americans who were forced to leave once the civil wars really erupted. And so I wanted to make sure that the novel honored that kind of global, regional, geopolitical context. I bring it back to the characters always, but that's why they hop around so much. And I also think it's like a part of history that maybe is not as well known. I think it's known to people who study Latin America, but I think to a general reader, it might be a little newer. And so I wanted to make sure that people were thinking about, the Salvadoran Civil War and the Cold War more broadly as this kind of regional conflict that the United States had a huge, huge impact on.
And that people in those three countries were in contact and sort of helping one another and sharing resources and ideas and everything.
Yeah, exactly.
So was there something specifically between those three countries that you wanted to share for us to know about, like the forgeries that were shared? What was it that line through those three, Cuba, Nicaragua, and El Salvador in particular, that you wanted us to learn about?
Above all, I wanted to capture this kind of sense of solidarity that crossed these countries. I think it's part of the reason, that Neto and Rafael are from two different countries. That was a really intentional choice. Neto's from El Salvador, Rafael's from Managua, a country that had a quote-unquote successful revolution in 1979. Yeah, I think I was really interested in this question of solidarity. I think I just pushed it to the most intimate and personal level by making it a love story on top of the political solidarity that they share.
So one thing that really struck me was that there was a lot of fear in your characters, particularly in El Salvador, that you could be snatched off the street at any moment, you could be thrown into a cell, you could just disappear. Maybe you end up as a dead body on the road, or maybe you just disappear entirely. And yet there was still a lot of hope. And I found this hope really through Neto and Raphael's love and their letters to each other. You seem hopeful. Let's talk about hope in this novel, Archive of Unknown Universes.
I mean, I think it was a necessary antidote when I was writing this. It's really hard when studying the Salvadoran War. And on this research trip, I was in the archives. I was at this museum reading about the things that had happened to people, the people that were displaced, the people that were killed. And that's really heavy. And it's, I think, easy and tempting to let that be the full story. But I think in any moment of turmoil, there's also, life goes on. People fall in love, people make dinner for each other, people have children. And I wanted to make sure to capture that in this novel. The fact that even when the background is really dire, life goes on in many ways.
So we have this diffractor, this amazing machine in this book, Archive of Unknown Universes, and your characters can look into it and see different things that might happen in their lives, different ways they could unfold. Then you gave us two possible scenarios, and in one, Neto survives, and the other, he doesn't. He disappears. Why those two? Why not go into like 12 different possibilities? Why take us down just two roads?
Yeah, well, writing a novel is so hard. I struggled so much to finish this thing, in part because of the structure. But I often find that when writing fiction, constraints are really helpful. And so I decided to do that and to focus on two. And it was also based on a kind of historical, kind of economic thing that happened with Salvadoran migrants. A lot of migrants from El Salvador, because the US was funding the Salvadoran Civil War, they had to deny that that's what they were doing. And so when Salvadorans came to ask for asylum, the majority had those claims denied, and a lot lived in the United States as undocumented immigrants. And there's a lack of stability that comes with that. And so that's part of something that separates the timelines, is the way that the characters were able to migrate. And it was one way of setting up the kind of difference.
So silence is really a big part of this book. What isn't said is almost as much as what is said. And you point out that when people die, they take secrets and all that silence with them into the grave, and we miss what happened. Their entire pasts that they don't even know about. Let's talk about silence. Is there a particular silence that we should be paying attention to as we're reading the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the main silence here is pretty early on in the novel. I established that these characters in 2018 want to know more about what their families went through during the Salvadoran Civil War. There's a huge silence around those experiences. And that is partially based on my own experience, right? Not learning these things about how the Salvadoran Civil War intersected with my family's history until I was in college studying it academically. But there's also been a lot of writing about how this is kind of the state for many Salvadoran families in the United States. And I was also interested in the idea that trauma can create silence, as I mentioned earlier. And so that's the big silence that then trickles down and shows up in different ways in each of these relationships and each of these characters.
So specifically, both Anna and Luis have mothers that have lived through the Salvadoran Civil War and won't talk about it. They won't talk about what their families did, what happened. And both of them, as a result, Anna and Luis are trying to dig into things that they're not supposed to know about. But of course, it's all they can possibly think about. So their journey is really trying to figure out these secrets. Let's talk about their journey. What is it that they're set on finding out?
Yeah, well, for Anna, it starts as a very specific thing. She finds this ID in the first chapter in her mother's things of a man she doesn't recognize or know anything about. And it kind of sets her on this bigger academic journey and personal journey to figure out who that man is and what her mother went through. So that's kind of like the kickoff for the book. And then Anna and Luis are, like I mentioned earlier, tied together by circumstance in many ways. And so he follows along on this trip that takes them to Havana and San Salvador and elsewhere.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Ruben Reyes Jr., and we are talking about his brand new debut novel, Archive of Unknown Universes. Ruben, there are a lot of threads, a lot of things happening in this book because we have two totally different timelines and things that could have been happening. How did you keep it all straight?
It was a challenge. I'll say that up top. But yeah, there was a lot of ways. I mean, I had note cards with different, sections on them. I had timelines. I had family trees. The structure really, towards the end, cemented itself, but it took a while. I had to write it in chunks and then figure out how to bring it back together in a way that made sense.
I bet. One thing that really struck me is the language. Anna and Luis are both students at Harvard. That's where they meet. And you mentioned in the book that they speak pretty much only English to one another. And yet at home, I presume that they're speaking Spanish. And so then they go on this research trip. And for the first time, they hear one another speaking Spanish. And they're sort of hung up. Anna in particular is like, Luis sounds weird. Like, what's he doing with that? Let's talk about that Spanish. And that really shocked me.
I mean, that is really pulled from my own experiences. I grew up in a household where my father came to the States a little bit earlier than my mother, and so his English is a little bit better. And for whatever reason, me and my siblings tend to talk to him in English and then talk to my mom in Spanish. And so I always grew up with that kind of duality. And then in college, I was dating someone who also spoke Spanish, but we would speak to each other in English because it was like the language we were most comfortable in. But I was really intrigued in this question of what the language you use to speak to someone says about your relationship to them.
Ruben, can I ask you to read for us one more time? I would love to hear the very beginning, that letter that starts the book.
Yeah, of course. R. I woke up thinking about Cuba. Do you remember the things we did as shadows danced on our shoulders? That was only a year ago, and already it feels like a lifetime has passed. Our cause, which started as musings and theory and theology, seems more important every day. It terrifies me that a war is around the corner, but I see no way of avoiding it. Amid it all, the intensity of our relationship still rattles me. Being with you, I know I've mislabeled my feelings in the past. Love is what I have for you. And I'm sorry for the moments I failed to express it. You said once that love is a spring that wells inside you until you want to scream about it, and that your only regret is that the world doesn't want to hear it from men like us. You're right that the world begs for our silence, pushing us into the shadows. I've shared the desires, beliefs I still cling to some lonely mornings. I know that makes you unhappy, and I'm sorry. At least I'm able to appreciate things for what they are, even if I'm not ready to shout them to the world. That also must be a sign of maturity, of growth. We're still young now, but we're no longer kids.
Ruben, that's just beautiful. Archive of Unknown Universes is really based on letters, love letters between Neto and Raphael. Is this a love letter to your own family, this novel?
Definitely. It's a love letter to El Salvador. It's a love letter to my family. A lot of the emotional questions at the heart of this, right? About how we know our family history, how migration shapes our lives for decades to come, how hard it is to break silences within a family. Those are all questions I've asked myself about my family. And yeah. And on a really basic level too, I wanted to represent El Salvador in as complex a way as possible. It's a place I grew up going to and that I love and that I know very well, and I just wanted to capture a little bit of my love for that country.
But you also bring up, there's the revolution itself in El Salvador, but you also bring the revolution with Rafael and Neto forward. So when their relationship starts, it's forbidden, it's secret, they're not allowed to be together. And then towards the end, same sex marriage becomes legal and they can actually be together. You bring that also full circle. Let's talk about that revolution.
I was really interested, in trying to drop myself into what I knew about this really hyper masculine movement in the 1970s. I was thinking a lot about the different ways that one could have probably dealt with their queerness at the time. And I think I chose them to take two different approaches. Raphael is pretty sure of who he is and doesn't kind of feel qualms about him, even though there are these pressures to keep some things kind of on the down low. Neto, on the other hand, has a really hard time coming to terms with his identity and with his relationship with Raphael. And the great thing about, going into 2018 is that I could kind of think about what would someone who grew up in that context in the late 70s think about the kind of movement towards marriage equality and other gains for queer people in the 2010s. And the journey is winding and it's not always moves forward, and there's still conflict in 2018, but I think there is a sense of progress. I think it's worth noting that this kind of legalization of civil unions that I write about in the novel is made up. El Salvador still does not officially acknowledge same-sex marriage, so there was a little bit of kind of future-looking hope in that section.
And also, Neto's sister, Esperanza, doesn't accept his sexuality, his love for Raphael in the beginning. But then there was sort of a glimmer of hope as she was on her deathbed. I read it as a glimmer of hope, was it? Where she squeezes his hand extra hard. And I felt like maybe that was her saying, I love you.
It's a very tense relationship. I think it's also a very real relationship. I think this is how our siblings are there to affirm us in some ways and also to challenge us in some ways, and conflict is always there, and so in that scene specifically I just wanted to, at least at the very least, paint a moment of connection for them because that was part of the relationship.
Ruben, for your day job, you are actually an editor. You work at Hachette, you work on nonfiction. How does that inform your writing?
Well, the first thing is that it really uses a different side of my brain. Being an editor is really different than being a writer, and working in nonfiction, I'm thinking about different things that I'm working in fiction. But what I love about it is that I get to work on history projects. And so I'm always asking these big questions about how history continues to affect us today. I'm working on right now a number of books, one on Reconstruction. I just signed some books on Japanese internment. And I think the big questions that these books ask will definitely inform future fiction, whether I know it or not at this point.
And how about your own editorial process? Like, you are an editor, and here you're trying to write your own novel. So how does that come into play?
Well, I think it actually makes me a better self-editor. I mean, the main goal of an editor, in my view, is to see what an author is trying to accomplish on the page and help them get there. I have to set aside my own kind of desires or tastes a little bit to do that. Which is why I love coming back to my fiction after the workday's over, because I can do what I want on the page then.
Right, you can make stuff up, and you can't do that in your real job.
No, not at all. But I learn a lot from every author I work with and every project I edit.
How about in terms of the publicity side and the book selling side?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I feel like I know a little bit too much about how the sausage is made. I have a lot of information kind of floating around my brain. Um, but I think it helps me reaffirm that, the most important thing with book is finding the right readers for it. Not every book is going to be, that Oprah pick or that book that goes kind of wild. Um, but a book can be successful and find its readers. A publisher and an author have to be really thoughtful about, who is this for and how do I make sure they hear about it?
So, what advice do you have for new writers?
I mean, the main advice that I, tell over and over and over, because I think it is the best advice, is to just read and read widely. I think when people are thinking about writing, they know the kind of books that they like, and they also know the kind of book that they might want to write, right? If you read a lot of thrillers, you're probably going to want to write a thriller. But I think it's really important to look at other genres, read poetry, because poets have a really interesting relationship to language that will help your own work. Read nonfiction because, the information in there might influence your book in a way you don't even know. I think it's really important to take as wide a scope as possible before you start writing your own.
Ruben, thank you so much for joining me today on Check This Out. I loved speaking with you.
Thanks so much for having me, Rachel. This was so, so, so lovely.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. If you or your book club have read any of the novels featured on the show, send us a note or a voice message to books@nhpr.org and let us know what you think. We would love to hear from you, and you might even hear your voice here on the show. Check this out. Now we're going to go to Zibby Owens and talk to her a little bit about publishing and what's coming up. Zibby is the founder of Zibby Media, which includes the award-winning daily podcast, Totally Booked with Zibby, Zibby Publishing in New York, and Zibby's bookshop in Santa Monica, California. I call it the Zibby universe. She is the author of 6 books, including the USA Today bestsellers Blank and On Being Jewish Now, which included one of my essays. We can all follow her, and you should, on Substack and Instagram, where she always tells it like it is. I also want to note that Zibby's bookshop in Santa Monica, California, is a sponsor of the show. Zibby, welcome to Check This Out. I'm so excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you started your own publishing company. You started Zibby Publishing. Tell me, why did you start Zibby's Publishing?
I did this on behalf of authors because I had interviewed hundreds and hundreds of authors on Totally Booked with Zibby, previously called Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. And I kept hearing over and over and over again some of the frustrations of the authors. And then once I started writing my own books and having them come out, I understood some of what they were talking about. And I wanted to see, is there a way that I could make any sort of change? Could I do things differently? And so I decided to try.
So as an author, what I've seen and what frustrates me and what I see around is from the time one of the older publishers buys a book until it comes out, you have 2 years. It's this very long process versus some of these newer indies can have a book out in 6 months, a year, just much faster. Are those some of the changes that you're also using?
Yes, we release a book a month. We try to shorten the turnaround times. We have gotten a book out within a couple months when I had my own anthology come out on Being Jewish Now. So it can be done. It is possible. I do think the lag times are tough. I think people try to guess at trends, and then by the time the books come out, the trends may have passed. And that's another thing that we don't want to do is write to the current trends. But yes, we're trying to shorten the time. We're trying to make every author be the center of attention. I feel like in traditional publishing, there is one book that they pick, and that's the book that gets all the attention and investment and touring and everything. And we wanted every author we published to feel equally celebrated because every book is a celebration. Every book is a major accomplishment. And so we tour our authors like it's, 1986 or something. And we really invest heavily in marketing and promotion and emotional investment, all of it to try to make a difference in a very crowded landscape.
So recently on the show, I had an author named Jennifer Armentrout who has a 6-book series called the latest one was The Primal of Blood and Bone, and she's publishing with a tiny, tiny indie called Blue Box Press. And I brought her on the show because she sold 1 million copies of this series with this tiny indie. And I'm just seeing more and more indies out there on the bestseller list, on the front tables when you walk into Barnes and Noble, and even self-published titles are out there. So you also own a bookshop and you're dealing with these indies and you're seeing them out there. What is your perspective on what's happening with these indie publishers?
I think as more authors grow frustrated with the consolidation of the big five and look to alternatives to get their stories out there, they are turning more to smaller independent presses or self publishing. And I think that as the smaller presses gain visibility and power, and as booksellers take the time to go through the catalogs of smaller publishers and stock those books, there is a sea change. You don't need to be published by the big five. It helps, I'm not going to lie. It definitely helps because of centuries old relationships with bookstores and some publications and things like that. It is a very relationship driven business. So it's not a slam dunk. But if you have a fabulous story to tell and the publisher does it right, it can be a huge success. We've had multiple USA Today bestsellers and Book of the Month Club picks and Target Book Club picks. And it's thrilling to see our books on tables in airports and all of that. So I think the days of only getting a book deal at the giant companies are over. And while it can be easier, it doesn't necessarily mean it's best for you. It's best for the book that they pick, but not necessarily all the books.
This is really why what you're doing at Zibby's Publishing is amazing because, like maybe 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, you would only see books from the big five out there, right? So you have the prestige of being with one of the big five publishers, but you also have the distribution, right? And just this reach and this ability to be able to get it into the New York Times or the Washington Post, book reviews or whatever. But your company and other companies like yours are figuring this out, right? And there's this whole sort of sub network of distribution that the big guys are now filling out. Let's talk about that because I think that's really what's enabling the smaller publishers to come up and have this presence in the bookstores.
Yes, I didn't realize the power of the distributor until I was on the publishing end of things. I remember when my first anthology came out, I would talk to my publisher and say, "Well, can I just like get in front of the sales team? Let me just present to them." And tell them, they're like, "No, no, no, you can't do that." And I was like, "Why? If they met me, I feel like they'd like me and they'd want to promote my book." Fast forward several years, and there I was in front of the sales team trying to, sell our books. But yes, distribution is another one of these closed systems, and there are several key distributors that you really need to have your books go through. We distribute through Two Rivers, which I am a huge fan of. They're part of the Ingram content group, and there are several giant distributors, and they take on smaller presses. So if you go through Edelweiss is the big website where if you are a bookseller, you go through the catalogs on this site and pick what you want to sell. And if you're part of Ingram or if you're distributed by a big publisher, your books will still be on there. They'll just be under that umbrella. And so the onus is on some of the bookstores, which is what we do, like to go through not just the big five catalogs, but the smaller catalogs as well.
But this fact that we can physically now get books that are either self-published or going with these very small indies or going with Zibby's Publishing, right? We can still get them through the same exact delivery method that we might get from the traditionals. And that's a really big shift.
Yes, from the end user perspective, you wouldn't know the difference. From the person at Barnes& and Noble who's out browsing the shelves, no one will know where it was distributed from. Nobody cares. The end user, you shouldn't even care. All it is that the little logo on the side of the book, whereas there were fewer before, now there are many more who have entered into the scene, and it is thanks to some of these distributors for taking a chance on smaller publishers. And then the readers, traditionally the readers don't shop by publisher as much as publishers like to think. Readers shop by book. So as long as you can get your books out there on the shelves, then it's up to the reader to make up their decisions.
So another big change, and I'm sure you're dealing with this every single day, is the rise of book talk. Let's talk about that and how much that is influencing what people are buying and reading these days.
Yeah, it's huge, and I'm so grateful for it. I feel like everybody bemoans the death of the publishing industry and, well, how are people going to read? Nobody's reading. But no, people are reading. I mean, at least they're holding up books, which is also great. I think that young people getting into books, getting into the emotions that they evoke, trying to get their friends to read it, that is how books sell, word of mouth. And this is just the tool of word of mouth for young people. I mean, this is how people share information and how things go viral. It's a really interesting new channel. Not every author is necessarily suited to be like on social media, and that's fine. But I think that the fact that there is a whole cohort of people coming up who know that if they love a book, they can take to social media and spread the word. That's amazing.
You are in a position where you both own a bookstore and a publishing company. So I think, in my mind, you really get to see what readers want and also what they're looking to buy and how they buy. So can you talk about how owning the bookstore is helping you become a better publisher or vice versa?
Yeah, I was actually just talking to our bookstore manager the other day about what's selling and what the trends are and everything. And I'm relieved to hear that no matter how good a cover is, if the book is not fabulous, people know. People want good quality books. They want interesting covers. They want stories that haven't been told, and they're really anti copycat books. So just because one book did well, like an Emily Henry book, 50 books that look just like it are not necessarily going to do well. And readers are very aware when people are trying, when the marketing is trying to play to that trend. So readers want books that are going to affect them deeply, that give them something new, and they're willing to take a chance on.
What specifically is selling right now? What are people looking to read?
Well, I think that people are still quite swayed by the big book club picks, by books that get giant coverage, are in the New York Times or have big platforms behind them because people don't have a lot of time, and so they are reliant on some of those mainstream things that they've come to depend on. But books that are selling are the ones that are resonating on many levels, whether it's a novel or a memoir or fantasy. They're new, they're different, and they're really well written. So that is very exciting to me.
We mentioned that they're the big five, right? The big traditional publishers that everybody knows about. What do you think they could improve? Can they catch up to the indies?
I don't think it has quite flip-flopped to that extent that they're trying to keep up with indies. But I like that. I think that
But hold on, I want to push back on this for a second because I see a lot of the big guys all of a sudden are starting smaller imprints and they are snapping up all these self-published authors who have, 5,000, 10,000 comments on Amazon or Goodreads, right? They've already established followings and then they're snapping them up for big advances and republishing them. So they are in some sense trying to keep up with the indies in the self-publishing industry.
okay, I like that. I agree with that too, because no matter what size publisher you are, you're trying to find the next thing. You're trying to find what is that spark that is catching, and how can I bottle it up and sell it. So you're right. You're 100% right. Yes. I think being nimble is easier for smaller players, right? You can move quicker. You don't need you're not a giant truck trying to make a sharp turn, right? You can scoot in and out like a motorcycle. So I think that ability to make quick decisions and react to the market, even what you're talking about, finding somebody who's taking off and publishing them, those are things that smaller publishers really can do.
When you look at other indies, are there lessons that you're learning from them and incorporating into Zibby's publishing?
I think we're just always looking to the market to see what's creative. We love doing creative things. We love bringing people together in person, throwing events all the time, connecting people through my podcast, having our authors reach people where they are, go on tour all over the place. And I'm always curious what fun new things people are doing to really get that in-person connection going. And there are great things.
Zibby, you're also a writer, and I understand that you actually gave back the advance for a novel that was supposed to come out recently and decided instead to devote all of your time to publishing, book selling, what you're doing now. Can you tell us about that?
I was just not that bullish on the drafts of the novel that I had written myself, and I just felt like, does the world really need a light, fun novel from me right now? Like, I just felt like that wasn't what I was meant to be doing. But I do have news that soon I do have another book coming out, but I'll just I'll just let that percolate, but it will not be a novel.
Zibby Owens, thank you so much for joining me on Check This Out.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novels A Bend in the Stars and Atomic Anna. You've been listening to Check This Out, a show where I get to do one of my favorite things in the world, talk to other writers about their brand new books. Check This Out is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the Penn Faulkner Foundation. I'll be back next week with another new author you should not miss. Our producer is Jessica Hunt. NHPR's program director is Emily Quirk. Our partner, the Penn Faulkner Foundation's mission is to champion the breadth and power of fiction in America. The show is sponsored by C&S Wholesale Grocers Family of Companies, the podcast Totally Booked with Zibby and Zibby's Bookshop, and the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation. Remember to go to your local library or bookstore and check out all the books that we're talking about this season. Thank you so much for listening. Read on.